Nicole Jacobs has spent her professional career working to tackle the problem of domestic abuse and to support those affected by it. She has worked with many domestic abuse organisations, including Stand Together Against Domestic Violence, where she later became CEO, and she now serves as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. For CIH Unlocked, and to coincide with this year's 16 Days of Activism against gender-based violence, I spoke with Nicole about how the new Labour government might achieve its ambitions around domestic abuse, including its desire to halve violence against women and girls over the next 10 years, as well as the role housing can play in both supporting domestic abuse survivors and to stop it from happening in the first place. Right. So the first question I've got for you then, Nicole, and it's a simple one, but I would say it's also quite an important one, which is kind of the scale of domestic abuse in England and Wales currently. So how bad would you say the situation is currently with domestic abuse in England and Wales?
Well, we know from the crime survey. So there's a crime survey for England and Wales, which isn't what is reported to the police, but it's when we survey across England and Wales about any crime that has been committed. In other words, can you tell me your experience of, you name it, and for domestic abuse, whenever people are asked the questions about any kind of violence in the home, we know that equates to 2.1 million people just in the last year. So of those 2.1 million people who will have said they were not just subject to domestic abuse in their lifetime, but in the last year, we know that probably only about 1 and 5 of those victims will report that violence to the police. And that could be down to any number of things. It could be sometimes people feel they want to address things themselves. They're not really sure that, we don't define and really we have defined domestic abuse, but a lot of people who experience it don't necessarily define it as domestic abuse at the time it's starting to happen to them or is happening to them. And so, it's very reasonable to find people who will have been subject to domestic abuse. That's very real, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've reported it to the police. And then, if we think about our criminal justice outcomes and the challenges within our criminal justice system, only about 6%, sadly, of that 1 in 5 who do report to the police who will see a successful outcome, meaning a conviction for that domestic abuse. So there's all sorts of statistics in this space, but I guess the whole point is it's so highly prevalent. We've defined domestic abuse as in law as the range of physical abuse, sexual abuse, the coercion and controlling behavior, economic abuse. And very importantly, we have defined children as victims in their own right. And so when I say the 2.1 million people, that doesn't even include children.
Yeah. And I'm speaking to you just a few months after we appointed a new Labour government in the UK, and they've pledged to halve violence against women and girls over the next decade. What are the mechanisms for achieving this?
Well, that is a very good question, and I'm trying to figure that out right now, because it's really, domestic abuse should not be a party political issue, and I am certainly not party political in my role. However, this set of ministers within government have quite a good knowledge about domestic abuse, in terms of some of their backgrounds, the charities they've supported, the amendments they've worked on in opposition. I have a real enthusiasm for this government's interest in knowledge about domestic abuse within the ministerial team in particular. However, and they have set out this huge mission, as you said, this idea of a safer streets mission. And part of that mission is, having violence against women and girls in 10 years. So as of today, I can tell you that it's really exciting to talk to civil servants and ministers and anyone in and around government, because that has created quite a lot of momentum for change, a lot of people willing to kind of think outside the box. What do we need to do more of? How do we achieve like a real cross-government strategy for taking that kind of ambition on? And traditionally in government, the domestic abuse work has been kind of held at the Home Office, the much more criminal justice departments. But to have violence against women and girls, or to have domestic abuse and all of those people who are victims of it, you would have to really expect so much more across government. What is the Department of Education doing in terms of prevention work in schools, that early help work? What about, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, housing, MHCLG's role in housing, in all of those things, but also health and social care. So many people, I did a survey of victims and survivors, and 3,000 people, over 3,000 people came back to me and said one of the first people they would think to tell or help seek support from would be medical health professionals. And so we need to do so much more to really achieve that ambition.
And obviously, I know the work you do as Domestic Abuse Commissioner isn't just focused on housing by any means, but how important is the role of the housing sector in meeting the government's ambitions around domestic abuse?
Well, it's huge in terms of, it's not at all. I was just in a meeting yesterday, for example, with a whole room of frontline domestic abuse workers, and one of the things said was, housing is fundamental. Housing is the key to victims and survivors of domestic abuse finding their own safe accommodation, or having, any number of things like locks changes so they feel safe at home. I think for years and years, there was this feeling that when you thought of housing and domestic abuse, you thought of refuge accommodation. And in Part 4 of the Domestic Abuse Act, that was definitely a priority of government in terms of just creating that duty, statutory duty for accommodation-based services. That's really important, and it's something that government needs to still ring fence the funding of, really keep an eye on that, so that refuge stays very much provided by specialist domestic abuse experts, all of those things. However, I'm a huge advocate, and will be a huge advocate in this government, for this kind of, I tend to use the term, and the term is used by others, whole housing approach to domestic abuse. In other words, when you think of victims of domestic abuse come in all circumstances. So some could be, in a home where they have a mortgage, they need help, sometimes quite complex help and financial advice about what that means if they're abused, if they're defaulting on a mortgage because of economic abuse, that whole host of things, all the way through to private rented accommodation, through to accommodation provided by registered social landlords, and the kind of quality of service that should be provided there. There's sanctuary schemes, the locks changes, all of those kinds of things, through to housing first, and victims who are street homeless. And the complexity of their needs really is exacerbated by, and sometimes caused by, domestic abuse. And so I think it is something, I talked earlier about, we've got to match our understanding of prevalence with our response. It needs to be more equally matched. And I think for a long time, we have thought of refuge and tick that box and that's it. And that just can't be the case with domestic abuse. So I had the opportunity of talking at an away day at MHCLG recently, and I do meet, of course, across with government. I meet with leads and civil servants, but I usually don't get to talk to kind of a whole room full of civil servants working on a range of things and related to social housing. And that was the point I made to them, that domestic abuse has got to be a thread absolutely through everything. So when we talk about the renters' rights bill or the private rented sector ombudsman, anything the government's proposing or doing, we've got to see that thicker thread or the greater understanding of, okay, what is it within this wider work where we enhance what we can do for victims of domestic abuse? And that would be a huge step forward, a huge win.
Yeah. And I think you might have touched on this a little bit already, but the new government, they at least appear to be very committed to housing and to supporting social housing. How might this support for the sector translate into better support and more support for those affected by domestic abuse?
In terms of what the last government did or achieved and some of the recent announcements by government. So, for example, in the Domestic Abuse Act, allowing, those to approach housing just as a standalone reason to approach homelessness or housing options teams by virtue of being a victim of domestic abuse, not having, it used to be, you could be a victim of domestic abuse, but if you were single, unless you had additional vulnerabilities, it was hard to approach. But now, by virtue of domestic abuse itself, this idea of removing local connection, for example, which has been recently announced, these are all really welcome things, but they're only as good as the options available, the capacity on the ground to really meet some of those demands. And so I feel like I have a lot of alliances in terms of just those overarching asks, but I would just go back to remembering, and I do think that domestic abuse and also this kind of links to the high level of victims who are women, women who are homeless. Some of those things interconnect and kind of can get lost in these wider programs of work. And we've got to bring the best of what we know happens, which is definitely out there, and make sure that government can help support the kind of capacity building and understanding. We don't have to recreate the wheel everywhere. We know some really excellent practice and what to build on and do more of that. So
yeah. And again, I think this is also something you've briefly touched on already. But just wondering kind of how the housing sector can work better with other public services like the police and health sector, to better tackle this issue.
Well, I think it's, having worked at the local level for a long time before this, I think for the larger housing providers, they have such a big footprint over many, many local authority areas, for example. They have to think carefully about how they engage with what really is, some of the difficulty or the challenge, which is very well worth overcoming, is just understanding the patchwork that is provided in each area. So you could be a housing provider in, let's just say 3 different local authority areas, and they may have 3 differing ways of advising or services provided for domestic abuse. And it takes that kind of effort, which is why linking in with the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and there's so much advice and expertise out there to help get that done. But I think if you do that and you link into not only the domestic abuse services, but the local partnerships and strategic partnerships for domestic abuse, you then open up the doors to all the partners at the local level who are most active and who probably really desperately, want to link with housing providers. And some of that happens in lots of areas, but it doesn't happen as much as it ought to. I believe there should be housing operational groups in areas which bring the variety of housing providers together to kind of make that much more efficient, that kind of sharing and expertise, having a lead within, within the housing provider who can kind of really help disseminate the best information. All of those kinds of ways of working really help, and there is a structure for all of that. I think I am into the new year. There is a Victim and Prisoners Act, which was passed right at the end of the last government, and there'll be a duty to collaborate, which it will bring together it will require all areas to really look at local provision for domestic abuse and sexual violence and things like that, where housing providers aren't named specifically, but should and could get involved with understanding that work coming together. All of that presents like opportunities for ways forward and better ways of working. And I mean, I would say it because I'm talking to you at CIH, but I mean, the kind of leadership that your organization brings to just keeping the best information, providing and supporting RSLs with the best of information is really, really important.
Despite the new government kind of voicing its commitment to tackling domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, there wasn't really much talk of funding for domestic abuse in the recent budget. So my question here is kind of, for the funding that we do have and that we might get in the future, how can we ensure that it is used as effectively as possible and with maximum impact?
It's a really good question. I poured through that budget document as soon as it came out. And one of the things I do appreciate now that I may not, when I worked in the domestic abuse sector and didn't work as closely as I do now with government, what I realize is that, the budget is, even though it's a very long document, it is very top line in some senses, and that within each government department, there is quite a lot of discussion going on right now about the departmental allocations. So I totally agree with you. I feel like for such a huge mission of government, we should see it much more high and clear. But I also would say right now, the government, that was a 1-year budget. That was for the next financial year. There's a lot of funding cliff edges in the domestic abuse sector where people are desperately just waiting to understand what's happening next year.
Yeah.
And I hope that will become clear as soon as possible. But I suppose in my mind, the bigger thing to keep an eye on is as departments are preparing for their multi-year spending review. They'll be submitting in the coming weeks to the Treasury for what will be announced in the spring, which is the first multi-year spending review. And I do think that's where I want to see those really specific plans from from the VOG group, from this mission group that is about having violence against women and girls. There will be a strategy that's set out that needs refreshing. All of that needs the funding attached. And I think that is where government has really got to show clearly across all departments, like we talked about earlier, where will we see the activity and the resource? And that's the huge question to answer. And I suppose within housing and MHCLG, the slightly more complex thing is to say, okay, even in these wider programs, like I said, where is the domestic abuse work and where do we see that defined more obviously than we have in the past? And so I think that those are all things to really look forward to.
Yeah. And final question then before we wrap up, and I opened with quite a general question, so I'll close with quite a general one as well. But how much work is there to do you think, still to do to tackle domestic abuse and violence against women and girls in England and Wales?
I mean, I'll try to answer it in a like honest but not too prolonged type of way. I mean, my belief is that we need real systemic change in order to properly do that. And so it is about changing kind of public perceptions and understanding, really focusing on who, it is the behavior of the perpetrator of domestic abuse who is really, is really causing these issues. And we don't have a lot of work oriented for that kind of behavioral change, sanctions, the whole range of things you would do. So we need a big investment there and shared understanding of what that good looks like there. But I think even within all of our systems, I talked about our very poor conviction rates. We have very high prevalence rates within children's social care, and housing, and we need each system to do its own kind of systemic change to really bring themselves into line and up to date with legislation on domestic abuse, really understanding it takes a lot of these various strands of work to get to that point.
Yeah.
And I think until we really structure the work of government, the resource of government to do that, we can't just keep funding. We need to fund victim care, obviously, but if that's the only thing we do, we're not curtailing these issues as much as we ought to be and should be. And so I do think it's possible, but I think it takes this real whole system approach.
Yeah, I just wanted to wrap up here anyway, and kind of just thank you for speaking with me today, sharing your
Thank
insight
you.
on this topic.
Thank you. And I would encourage anyone listening, have a look at if you've not heard some of those whole housing or DAHA, those types of very specific housing related domestic abuse initiatives, just Google that, look that up and see what's there and how it relates to your work. And also just to say, if you're a victim or survivor, we do have a Voices at the DAC platform that you can sign up to hear updates from our office. We often circulate opportunities for victims and survivors to get involved and feedback about various kind of bits of research, policy, all sorts of things. So there's lots of ways to get involved. So I just wanted to make sure I'd say that. And a huge thank you to CIH for all that you do and have done in the past to really help us understand what's out there and what we should all be doing within housing.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think the appreciation is mutual, to be fair. So,
Thank
so yeah,
you,
yeah.
William.
Thanks again, Nicole.
Great. Thanks.